haere mai, and welcome to Cult Chat, the podcast where we talk about coercion, control, and all things cultish. I'm Dr Caroline Ansley. I'm a medical doctor. As a child, I lived at the Centrepoint community, a notorious cult in New Zealand, and now I run a website that advocates for the former children of the community.
I'm Liz Gregory, and I run the Gloriavale Leavers Support Trust, and I'm privileged to walk alongside people after leaving this group as they embark on their new lives.
And I'm Lindy Jacob. I'm a former member of the Exclusive Brethren, and I'm part of the Olive Leaf Network, a new initiative in Aotearoa to support leavers of high-demand religious groups. Come with us as we unpack the cult playbook. We'll be talking to experts and leavers of coercively controlling groups, and we will call for Kiwis to cult-proof their lives.
Come with us as we traverse the cultiverse.
A warning, this podcast contains references to subjects and discussions which may be difficult for some people to hear. Please take care of yourselves and your whānau when listening.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to Cult Chat. Today we're going to be having a little chat about Parliament, government, and what we can do about cults. You see, I've got a guest here, Dr Janja Lalich, and Janja came out to New Zealand to participate in the Decult conference that was last weekend, but her duties didn't end there.
No, they wouldn't let me go.
And so we welcome you today to talk about what you've been doing after the Decult conference, and that doesn't include trips to
Maori villages, geothermal wonderlands,
and today we're off
Hobbiton.
So we found time to have a wee chat together about our trip to Parliament.
Mm-hmm.
Just giving in background to those of you who aren't aware, after the Decult conference, a few of us decided that we would take some of the experts and the speakers, go to Parliament, run an event there in their banquet hall, invite MPs and also other people from other social service organisations or civil service, and we called it Unmasking Cults, and then we had some meetings the next day with National and Labour Party MPs. I think the evening dinner event, Janja, what were you expecting there? We invited you to come to Parliament. What did you expect?
Oh, well, I didn't. I really had no idea what to expect, we first walked in. Well, first you see this incredible building, and I'm like, take a picture. I have to send this home. It would be extremely rare for something like this to happen in America, I have to say, even at the state level. So to be walking into national government headquarters was just like awesome, I have to say. And I wasn't sure what the dinner was going to be. And I, again, gave an opening speech. And again, the interest was amazing. I mean, I sat at a table with several, not MPs, but two representatives, one from a child welfare organization and the other from, I believe it was like women's rights or something like that.
Yes, there was the Children's Commission office represented there, and National Council of Women.
Yeah, and there were a number of speakers after me, and both of them, the tables had little pads of paper and pens, and they were writing. They took so many notes, they needed extra pieces of paper. I mean, I was like, whoa, there's really a lot of interest here. And then, of course, afterwards, we all just kind of milled around and talked to different people, and really, people were saying, what can I do? We need to do something about this. Like, this is not good. This is not good. It's not a good image for New Zealand. The focus here was Gloriavale. I think it became very clear to the people who were there at that dinner that something needs to be done. And it's quite a travesty that nothing yet really has been done seriously to break down that community.
Yes, so our evening event, we decided to not just have a focus on Gloriavale, but just to expose some of the wider, cultic activity happening in New Zealand. I think that our government thinks that Gloriavale is the only sort of...
Excuse me.
Yeah, I think our government thinks Gloriavale is our only sort of problem, and I wonder if that has led to a little bit of sort of relaxed feeling. It's probably
for some of the other groups.
For some of the other, and it's not worth them perhaps doing any legislative work or policy development or putting a group together because it won't be needed soon. But I don't find that to be a helpful approach. I think we're always going to have use of coercion and control in groups, whether they're religious or any other kind of group. And so it's actually worth looking into how thought reform works, how these groups operate, and whether we give them benefits like tax benefits, when really they behave so badly, they steal people, really, don't they? They're people stealing groups. I think walking through the corridors of power, you just come to appreciate that we actually live in a democracy, and we vote, and they're representing their constituents. And I really want to say thanks to Camilla Lalich from Labour and James Meagher from National, who helped put together the evening. Camilla and her team hosted the evening event supported by James and his team, and then we had meetings with each respective party and a number of MPs the next day. So the evening event was a little wider.
I have to clear my throat.
Go for it.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, so the evening event was a little wider than just Gloria Vale, and I think there was a shock when we sort of suggested there may be up to 50,000 people who are caught in New Zealand in these coercively controlling groups or who are deeply impacted by them. And the little pieces of paper you're talking about, it was a last minute idea I had. We had 7 people speaking, former survivors. We had Lindy from the Olive Leaf Network. Ulrika, she's from the Cult Federal Agency in Austria. We had Caroline Ansley, and she's a medical health professional. That's you, Caz, that's our Cult Chat host, and she will be talking about that. And so it was a powerful opportunity. We had a former Gloria Vale leaver speaking as well, which was, like the soul of the evening, faithful disciple speaking there. And so what we had is just this mix again of experiences, and we're just trying to highlight issues. What are the big messages you think
Of that evening?
Yeah, that government need to hear. Well,
I think, first of all, I said this in the meetings the next day, I'm here from America. Who am I to tell you how to run your government? But essentially, these are really international issues of children's rights, about labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And so it's not so much that I want to tell you how to run your government, but I want you to be able to recognize that these groups exist and that there is harm being done, and that as government bodies, you can do something about that harm. You can, pass legislation, you can get charges made. Apparently there's been a lot of investigation, yet no charges have really been filed. And you can go there for yourself and see what goes on. Apparently what's been happening a lot is when the officials go in, they only talk to the leadership. They don't talk to the average person who lives, for example, in Gloriaville. Those are the people who are going to tell you what's really happening. The leadership's going to tell you what you want to hear.
And obviously in the case of Gloriaville, there had been quite a number of police charges and arrests for those who have perpetrated crime. What we haven't had is the charges laid against the leadership, the collaborative group, for creating conditions for what looked like modern day slavery.
Right.
And that's where the frustration is.
Yes.
You can charge someone who was doing physical offending or sexual offending, and that has been occurring and needs to continue occurring in the Gloriaville context. But our question is, what about the level higher than that?
Right, the larger scale.
The larger group, the group that knew about it, covered it, allowed it, their belief system that they preached and taught, created the conditions for ripe offending. Do they just get let off the hook? And we say no, they shouldn't be allowed to get let off the hook. I think leavers are looking for those people to be held accountable. Leavers are so gracious, they can even accept that some of the people who've become perpetrators were firstly victims themselves, and they're all victim of a bigger system. You kept saying something interesting to the politicians around sending your kids there for 6 months.
Yes.
What's that all about?
Yes, well, I thought, since they really seem to be circling around the issue and not really holding the right people accountable, I thought, well, if every politician just sent their children there for 6 months, and then let's see what they want to do, if they're ready to act at that point.
So let's think about your lifetime. You grew up in a cult. You didn't grow up in a cult.
No, I didn't grow up in a cult.
Let's think about your life experiences. You ended up being recruited and joining a cult, a political cult, in your 30s. And then post that, you've gone on and you're now a professor
Professor Emerita.
Now you're a professor emerita at a university in America. You've written books. This is a personal life experience which you have used and turned for good. Can you tell us about some of the interactions you've had with sort of government or FBI, or how they've made use of your expertise?
Well, I would say the other than having been expert witness in a number of legal cases that have been both criminal and civil, there were years when America was fighting the, quote, war on terror, that I was invited to do quite a bit of work with some of the intelligence communities, including the Five Eyes, which are the 5 countries who work together. And basically, they wanted to learn from my experience and my working with survivors could be applied to the situation with terrorism and former terrorists, and how can you encourage people to leave that mindset, and then what will help with recovery for those who do leave. So that was quite a lot of work that I did, I'd say around 2009, 10, and 11. That has eased off now. So primarily it's when there is some local case where they may want to interview me to see how what I've learned and what I know can be applied to whatever situation is being investigated.
Because they're drawing the parallel, aren't they, between just ways that people get indoctrinated.
Right.
And so people inside cults get indoctrinated, and then they carry out the wishes of the cult leader.
Right.
People getting pulled into terrorism get indoctrinated and then carry out the wishes
of the leader.
The leader.
Very similar, yes.
And so you're trying to help. And I feel like that's where our government has not done so well. I don't think we've been reaching out to experts. And I recall a number of years ago having another meeting up at Parliament and saying that Glorivale was a cult, and they looked at me blankly and said, well, do you have any evidence? I'm like, yeah, here's all the levers stories, here's the characteristics of a cult, match them up, 29 out of 30. That wasn't good enough. They wanted research to have been done and expert witnesses, and we're sitting here in little old New Zealand and there are none. there's no cult expert psychologist sitting in New Zealand at that point.
There will be now.
Yes, I think that's the exciting thing about the conference we've been to, is that there's been this call for people to, make use of their professional skills and to prioritise, I guess, more wide understandings in this area.
Yes.
America seems to have a lot of this great expertise. Perhaps they need to share a little around. New Zealand, are you tempted to move here? It's nice and green. We have a green country.
I may be here sooner rather than later if things go the way I fear they will.
Yeah, so I guess just thinking about governments and Parliament, unless people speak up, governments would rather just ignore these difficult topics, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I think I'm not quite sure. Well, certainly in some cases, politicians are bought off. I'm not saying that happens here, but it certainly has happened in my country, or people are, sort of taken around on cruises, or, shown, like they'll go visit some place and they'll put on a song and dance show for the politicians or whoever is there, the legislators. So, there've been some inroads in the States, and I think we do have quite a few people working in this field, but it's also such a vast country, so it really kind of goes state by state. So even with, recovery resources, in terms of educating therapists how to work with survivors, I mean, that's one of the biggest things that I'm pushing on right now, because if you're a licensed therapist in America, you can only practice in the state in which you're licensed, right? So I have someone coming to me saying, I just left a cult in Michigan. Is there someone who can help me? And I'm like, well, I'm in California. So I have to like suss around and see if I can find any sort of cult savvy therapists in Michigan. So it's really quite a challenge. I think for you that'll be a lot easier here, because you're kind of the equivalent of one state compared to this vast country that I come from. But I think one of the biggest issues for all of us is recovery resources for survivors, and especially for children, because second and third generation children, many of these cults have been around for decades, like the ones here, Exclusive Brethren, Gloriavale, you name it. And so you have children leaving in droves, not necessarily as children, but as adults who grew up in that environment, yet they are so stunted in their development because they weren't allowed to go through normal developmental processes and stages. So again, having resources available not only for sort of mental health recovery, but just practical resources. I mean, people leave these groups without anything. In many cases, they don't even know their name. They don't have a birth certificate. They don't know if they have relatives on the outside who weren't part of the group. They don't know where to go. They end up on the streets. The suicide rate is just phenomenal and way above national average.
Yes, you shared that at the meeting with Parliament. I think that was quite a shock.
Yes.
There's 6 times...
It's 6 times suicidal ideation and 10 times actual suicides of the national average. Now, those statistics were for the United States and Australia, because for the interviews I did for my book, Escaping Utopia, there were several people from Australia and the UK. But I'm sure if a study was done here, the rates would be similar.
Yes, I think. And that's a great concern, I think, in the Gloriavale sphere. The more years that people just live in this little closed microcosm. And, there is a lot of confusion and a lack of hope for the people in Gloriavale now, which actually will add to their stress because of all the eyes sort of focusing on them. So we're aware that for many years there has been a certain stability in their group, but that came because there was this intense control. Now that that's been wrenched from them, there's this uncertainty, and that creates an extra layer of stress, perhaps hopelessness, despair. What will my future look like? I feel like I can't control it. So, there's definitely a danger zone there as well. You just spoke about the impacts on second generation and that developmental stunting. Can you just unpack that a little more? Why is it that our government officials need to understand the real harm done to people living in coercively controlling groups, even if they haven't personally experienced sexual abuse or, say, physical beatings or even labour trafficking? What's the harm?
Well, the harm is that if you're born into or raised from a young age in one of these closed groups that I call them self-sealing systems, your development is not of your own accord, let's put it that way, right? Everything is more or less orchestrated for you. So as humans, there was a psychologist named Erik Erikson who did the really foundational work on child development, and there's 8 stages that we go through that are, birth to 3 years old, 3 to 5, et cetera, et cetera. Normally, in each of those stages, you the way he described it, you face a certain crisis, and the way in which you're able to resolve that crisis lets you, so to speak, graduate to the next phase, right? So it's about attachment, it's about learning to trust, it's about developing self-confidence, these various things that when you're a child growing up in normal society, as if there is such a thing, you're doing that on your own. You're finding your own way. You're finding your own self. You're figuring out yourself, who you want to be, especially in the teen years, the preteen and teen years. Those are very, very fundamental. And that's when you're experimenting and you're trying different things and you're rebelling a little bit against your parents and you're maybe getting a tattoo or a nose ring or something, right? It's like and that's when you're kind of feeling out, like, do I want to hang out with this group or that group? And what do I actually believe in? And my parents listen to this on the radio. Well, I'd rather listen to that. And when that can't happen of your own accord, you're basically being shaped by someone else, by something else. And when you're not allowed to entertain beliefs or philosophies outside of this system that you're closed in, you're not able to then say, oh, well, I don't know about that belief. I'd rather believe in that. Or I don't know, let me think about how to treat animals. Maybe I want to get into animals, whatever it is. You're not able to do that on your own. And so you end up being this kind of closed, formulated person, but not your own person. And so when those individuals leave, they have to figure out who the hell they are. And that, at age, say, 27 or maybe even age 40. And that's not easy. And so, it's just tragic. It is tragic. And it's, across the world, I swear to God, there have to be millions of people growing up in these closed groups.
I'm thinking about you talking about, and we're here having an interview together and you've put your hand sort of over your face, and it reminded me of that sort of cloned, people get this cloned sort of effect when they've all been brought up in the same kind of group. And I recall that sitting in one of the employment court trials for Gloria Vale and just watching woman after woman after woman still in Gloria Vale testifying on the stand, and the sameness of their response, the sameness of their look, the words they spoke. It was a limited pool of sort of phrases and way of speaking. And then I looked at the diversity of those who had left, who have kind of gone on their own journey of fun, and they were just people who had some life. They explained things differently. Their vocab was a little more sophisticated and open, and I just saw this huge difference. And I know the court saw it, the judge. You can't help. And that's that idea of being indoctrinated and sort of, I guess, brainwashed. Isn't it? Where you all become a clone.
Exactly.
But they maintained black and blue, these women, that they chose it, that they're there of their own free will. And I just find that such, how do you break through to someone to make them realise they actually didn't choose it? They were born into it. What they did is they chose to continue in the system and sign up further into adulthood out of fear of all the things they've been told might happen to them if they dared step outside.
Or challenge. Yeah. No, it's that closed thinking. I mean, but I think what happens over time through whatever indoctrination program in each group is that the pressures become so great, and most groups operate on fear. They're fear-based, right? So they're making you afraid to do anything different within the group, and they're making you terrified about the outside world, right? It's evil. You're going to die if you go out there. You're going to, your family's going to die. If you leave, you're never going to see any of these people again, more than likely. And so this fear and anxiety and stress, it just envelops you. And you get to the point where, in a sense, the cult member becomes like a little microcosm of the cult, right? And so at that point, what we might call free will, at that point, I believe that your will is altered, and you are then following the will and the immorality rather than the morality of the cult leader, right? Even if you join as an adult and you have a sense of morality, that is going to be changed and broken down. And everybody becomes like just this little minion, right? Just exactly what you described. And I remember in the early days, in the 70s and 80s, when cult recruitment was very rampant in the United States, and parents would say, I just saw my son or daughter, and they have this 10,000-mile stare. That's how they used to describe it, right? Yes. And they used to think, well, they must be on drugs. They must be hypnotizing them. No, cults don't need to use drugs. They're using basic social psychological mechanisms to the hilt to just crush you and suppress you and mold you into this perfect little cult member.
that's why people leaving use the words, I woke up, I broke free, and they say you need to listen to us, not the people who are still in there, because they say, I've experienced both of these perspectives.
Yes.
Actually, it reminds me, inside our Parliament, do you remember a brilliant quote that one of our former Gloriavale members came up with, Faithful Disciple? He said, you need to stop talking to the leaders and start talking to the leavers, because essentially they're the ones that have the perspective. They can actually look back and make sense of what happened to them. And Trudy Christian was there, and Trudy's one of the very few people who've left Gloriavale and have achieved
a college degree,
a university degree, which is incredible. But, you know, she was talking to me around these meetings in Parliament, saying that there was only ever one MP that she recalls who went to Gloriavale. She was concerned about women and women's education, and she said she sat there for a long time waiting for something to change. This visit surely must have created some impetus, and how disappointed she was when it didn't happen. That MP did some fantastic work. There were media articles, but she wasn't in a party that was in any power, and those in power at the time didn't pick it up and run with it. Although I think it's hard to apportion blame in a governmental... It's been 50 years of failure. It's multi-governmental. It's kind of bigger than that. I like what the chair of our trust said, Al Aiken. He said, we can discuss whose fault this all is. We can apportion blame. I'm not actually interested in finding out where to place the blame. I want to know who is going to put their hands up and be the one that solves the problem.
Excellent.
What a great call. You know, so we actually went to Parliament. We weren't there to provide a whole lot of gory details about things that had happened or gone wrong in Gloriavale. That's been settled. We know that.
Right.
The question and the aim of this particular visit was, where to from here? When are you going to start speaking to the survivors? We've had the Royal Commission report landed about 3 months ago, which said that there are still ongoing concerns, and the leaders from times past need to be held accountable. And it's actually their job to start engaging with survivors to find ways forward. And so... And,
you know, maybe I'm being a Pollyanna, but in those two meetings with the two different parties here, I mean, it was a little disappointing in that so few attended, but the ones who did, I did feel, and I don't know what were we meeting for, about an hour or so?
Yeah, an hour each party.
Yeah, I did feel that you just saw a change in their facial expression as the hour progressed. And you even saw some teary, I felt. I mean, maybe I'm being Pollyanna and maybe I'm projecting, but I did feel like we touched those individuals, and that some of them hopefully will go on and get something done.
I think so. I think one MP was particularly engaging, and he was the last one there with our group. Others had to come and go from the house. It was a speaking day, and he asked genuinely, you know, what's the difference between religion and a cult? And the answer you gave was just brilliant, and his eyes just went, oh, like I get it. It was simple. Can you tell us what your answer was?
Sure. So, and I get asked this quite a lot. So the way I see it is, I divide it, I look at it between a healthy religion and an unhealthy religion. And I always preface it by saying, in reality, cults have nothing to do with religion. It's not about religion. And there are certainly many, 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 many different kinds of cults that are not remotely religious or spiritual, but even the ones that are, it's not about religion. So if you look at the group, a healthy religion, you're going to be worshiping some higher power, whether that's God or Allah or Buddha or a tree or I don't care, whatever it is, but you're worshiping a larger power, a greater power, a universal power, so to speak. Whereas in an unhealthy religion, you're going to be worshiping this guy who's standing right in front of you, this living human being. That's who you're supposed to worship and honor and obey, right?
And they would deny that, wouldn't they? But it's all down to the obedience.
Right. Secondly, in a healthy religion, you may be given guidelines to live by, right? Like be a good Christian, be a good whatever. Someone moves into your neighborhood, take them a cake and welcome them. Say the Catholic Church is going to say to you, don't use contraception. but they're not going in and checking. They're not going into your bedroom to see if you're using contraception. They're not going to grill you about whether you actually took a cake to your neighbor, whereas an unhealthy religion is going to do that. Another, I think, important factor is with a healthy religion, if you decide to leave and go on, maybe start going to a different church or stop going to church at all, you're not going to be shunned by your friends and neighbors. They're going to see you in the grocery store. They're going to say, "Hi, Liz, how are you?" Whereas in an unhealthy religion, 99% of the time, if you leave, you are going to be totally shunned, and in many cases, completely stripped from any kind of relationship with your family who may still be in, which is one of the reasons so many people don't leave, because they don't want to face that loss. And so we can go down the road like that and see the exact differences between belonging to a healthy religion or spiritual group, having that belief system, whereas in an unhealthy religion or spiritual group, that belief system is weaponized to control you and contain you and confine you.
The word confine, I think that's the key, isn't it? That leads to the concept that cults are really about mental slavery. And in the case of Gloriavale, we believe there are actually the indicators of more than just mental slavery there. And so we are waiting expectantly. It's been 2 years since the police said they were investigating Gloriavale leadership for slavery. There have been no charges laid. I think that would be probably one of the most powerful actions they could take at this point, to say enough. It's illegal to hold people in captivity in that way. Well, I want to thank you, Janja, for coming to New Zealand, for your willingness to speak at conferences. You did a university lecture as well at Canterbury University, and you came to Parliament, and we've just spent the last 3 or 4 days trawling up the island from Wellington. We're heading into Auckland, where Janja will fly out from, and so today is Hobbiton Day, so I think we'll wrap up here. But stay listening in for Caz and Lindy's recollection of their time in Parliament. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Kia ora to Caz and to our listeners. Hey, that was so fantastic listening to Janja and Liz have a little reflection, korero, on the time at Parliament. I felt like I was sitting in the back seat of their car as they continue their road trip around New Zealand.
Yeah, I felt a bit like that too, just tagging along. I wanted to go to Hobbiton as well.
Tagging along for the ride, but you and I were not with them, so here we are. They've passed the baton to us, and we are going to finish the rest of this podcast sharing our own reflections of the time in Parliament. It was so great to be there with Janja, Liz, and a whole lot of other people from the Gloriavale Leavers Support Trust, with Ulrika Scheiser, with a whole lot of people. Fantastic opportunity it was, and hats off to Liz and the Gloriavale Leavers Support Trust team for organising it. So I mean, it was titled Unmasking Cults, which I thought was really bold of her. Liz just loves that word cults. I'm not so convinced of its usefulness because, it just is a bit of a tricky word still to define. But she was just bold with it, eh? There was there on the PowerPoint for the politicians in the room coming in to see unmasking cults. It made it very clear that is what we were here to talk about. And so as she said, there were 7 speakers. We had kind of about 5 to 10 minutes each to share different aspects of what we perceive as the realities of a cult problem in New Zealand.
Yeah, it was like we had 2 hours to convince these people who are in influential positions. It wasn't just the MPs, there was also a whole lot of other people in positions of influence in Wellington, in our capital city, where our Parliament is, that of all the things that are currently on the political table, on the social table, that this should be picked up and this should be taken notice of. And as I keep on saying to people, I feel like when it comes to cults, we're in the 1940s with domestic violence. Back in the days when everyone was sort of saying, it's just it's a relationship issue, it's an intimate issue, it's not our issue. That's where we are now. So we have to convince New Zealand, and we were trying to convince this room of people, many of whom who in their own little spots, in their own spheres, can do something maybe to shift the focus in the right direction. So what was your impression, Lindy, about well, being there for one thing. That was pretty awesome. And how it went.
Well, yeah, I love what you said just then, Kaz, about it feeling this whole issue feeling a little bit like something like domestic abuse in previous decades. That it does feel like there is a real wave of awareness that's happening now, not just this year, but even in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, around the world collectively, as well as here in New Zealand, about this stuff. And it's a fascinating question, and it's one I do get asked often by kind of members of the public or journalists. It's kind of this question of does New Zealand have a culty problem? If so, what is it? What's the scale of the problem? What actually is the issue? And so it was incredibly helpful to for those 2 hours to be discussing these things. And it was definitely a question. Those kind of questions came up of what's the difference between a religion and a cult, as Liz and Janja have just discussed, and how do we kind of balance. I was chatting with one of the MPs afterwards, and he was kind of making a case for like the fact that he has to consider all people in their constituency. And so, like, he was talking about how often leaders of these groups or members absolutely come and try and get on side with them, and might invite them to come and speak at their events, or might invite them for tours of their school, or want to kind of lobby them over issues that are of key concern to those particular groups. And he was like, it's our job to listen to people. Like, we have to give them our ears. We do have to listen to them and listen to their concerns and take them on board. But at the same time, it's around how do we do that in an educated way so that we're not being kind of having the wool pulled over our eyes as to their true intentions or that sort of thing. And yeah, I found it really fascinating. One of the things Ulrika said on
Ulrika
that note,
Scheiser.
from Austria, so one of the speakers at Decult, she talked about their kind of cult watchdog federal agency. She said that one of the most important things they do is to give counselling to current and former members of cult-like or high control or extremist groups. And she said that is incredibly powerful for us because then we hear kind of what's actually happening in the groups, what's happening on the ground, what's the kind of hidden culture and sometimes hidden agendas that the leaders of these groups or the people who come and lobby, or when they approach them, the kind of slick answers that they've got, it's sometimes a very different picture. And she talked about how important that was. And this was just a wee discussion I had with one of the politicians, because he was like, yep, I admit it, we definitely get lobbied by these groups. We don't always know who they are. Our desire is, of course, to take them at face value and to listen to them. And yet he was like, oh, it's quite hard to find the time to kind of research each person who comes to you and each group behind them, and to kind of find out what is the real picture here. But we were just talking about how important that work is for our government officials to be getting a full picture of who they're engaging with.
Yeah, well, I felt in some ways being there, it felt like I was teaching Nana to suck eggs. Is that the saying? Because it felt to me so obvious, and I often forget that what I know and what I've experienced is not just bread and butter. And I think it's always very confronting to be in an audience and have people frantically scribbling their notes, and you go, oh, you didn't know this? I thought that was quite basic stuff. But it's not basic, obviously, it's not. And it's new to many people. And if you don't have reason to step into the world of someone very different from yourself, and you don't have any of the points of reference in which to fill in what it might be like for that person, then it's very hard to even think about, let alone to go into the details and think about their risks and their experiences and the things that have harmed them and what it might be like to recover. So that's what I felt sitting there. I felt like there was just this penny dropping, pretty big one, and actually quite a lot of pennies dropping. And and each time, because each person who presented, they had 9 minutes-ish, and at the end there was a slide that went up about, what was it, the asks, the things that we were asking for, and in a really practical way, this is what you could do. And each time that little slide came up on at the front, the pens just really, they really kind of started to scratch quite fast. And so that was encouraging to me to think that there might be these gems of practical and emotional, because they were moved. So there was a lot of emotion there, but actually that might translate into something practical that could be applied. I mean, I did also feel a sense of overwhelm as well, because, things aren't in a great state, as we all know. And, where does this great need drop into a bucket of great need? So that,
Yeah.
it has to, and I guess that's the role of loud voices and stories. Stories sit in your heart and they just don't go away. So I guess that's what we were hoping to achieve, weren't we?
Yeah, yeah. And on that note, it was amazing to hear from a former Gloria Vale leaver. Like, I know the thing that stood out to that I can remember that like was just so painful to hear was he talked about how he's, I don't know, what is he, in his 30s or 40s, but he's got like significant hearing loss because the Gloria Vale employment situation that he was in had never allowed him to have hearing protective equipment, even though he was working with loud machinery. And you're like, man, that's just a really tangible example of somebody who's left their group and it was, got support and everything through the Gloria Vale Leavers Trust, and yet has actually got a lifetime health impact that is going to impact him and his family for the rest of his life as a result of this group. It's this group's fault. And yeah, that was just one story of like a number, and it was really tangible because I think that's kind of another myth that's out there is like, oh, like it's hard, why don't you just leave? And once you've left, then like you're good, right? And actually no. And that's why I thought your talk was so powerful, Caz. I wish, you should really just record the whole thing for our listeners because, yeah, you were diving into as fast as you possibly could in 10 minutes some of the health impacts that are being evidenced from people in high control groups. Like, can you tell us some of the things that you shared?
What I did was I talked about it's a bit tricky because there is no study specifically on cults in New Zealand right now. There is, and there are no studies in New Zealand that look at the impacts on children and cults. But I did talk about, I talked a bit about my own personal experience, and then I talked about the one piece of research that New Zealand has got on New Zealand-based cults, and it came out in 2010, was commissioned by the Community Growth Trust, which was the former fund, which is the fund that came out of Centrepoint once Centrepoint closed down, and it looked at 29 now adult children of Centrepoint, and it explored their experiences, and it showed a whole lot of things about their impacts, like relationship impacts, increased alcohol and drug use, dental issues, problems with identity, problems coming to terms with their experiences. Yeah, a wide range of impacts. It was only 29 people though, so the group is smallish. But what the takeaway for me was that there were clear rehabilitative needs for these children. They didn't just come out of the group and go, "Oh, what a lovely growing up, a free hippie experience I had in my childhood. Wasn't it great to live there?" No, they had really very significant lifelong consequences. And
Exactly.
a third of them identified then, 14 years ago, that they were sexually abused. I personally think that number's wrong because of how many people I have talked to at Centrepoint. So they say a third from that study, but I know people in that study who have told me, I said I wasn't sexually abused then because I didn't realize then that I was. So it's more than a third because it was so normalized, the sexual abuse at Centrepoint. You didn't even think that getting into bed with your stepfather naked was sexual abuse. That was just fooling around, so it takes some adult kind of coming to terms with to realize that. So, I shared that research, and then I talked about the Dunedin and the Christchurch longitudinal studies, which are studies that have looked at contemporaneous children who live in New Zealand and have grown up in New Zealand and followed them for 40 to 50 years, depending on the study, and looking at what does it look like for those children. There's many of them. I think there's about 2,500 children in New Zealand, not cult kids, but kids who also are exposed to harmful experiences much oh, not the same as obviously a cult, but some harmful experiences. It looks at how much do they cost our country, when they are exposed to adverse experiences in childhood, and then they've got limitations in their future life. So it's sort of drawing the parallels between letting kids just sort of sit around in harmful, toxic environments and doing nothing, and what does that look like for a government to manage 30 to 40 years later? Yeah, well, those are the kind of main ideas I talked about, and I talked about how come there aren't any checks and balances, and where's the scrutiny around, allowing young children particularly to stay in a harmful environment and not kind of doing anything about it. And yeah, so that was some of the thoughts, and then I went on to talk a bit further about what I think should happen, but we can talk about that in a bit. I'm curious about your talk and what you told this room of politicians and influential leaders in our country. I mean, I was very moved by your talk, actually. You're quite the skillful orator. Lindy, it was very moving, actually.
Was it?
Yep, yep.
Oh wow, yeah, I did definitely feel like I got a bit fired up there. But it's because it matters, I mean, yeah, I think, it's something Liz mentioned right at the outset of the night. But it's just this thing of Gloria Vale, is well known across New Zealand, which is kind of amazing, but in some ways it's kind of a challenge for those of us from other groups or who have concerns about other groups because they're so extreme. People think, oh, there's nothing else that's that extreme. Whereas in my opinion, there are a number of groups across our country. Some of them are smaller, some of them are bigger, some of them are really under the radar, but who are operating with just as high levels of control and arguably coercive control as what Gloriavale has. But because they don't wear a uniform or live in a commune on one piece of land, they are just nowhere near as recognizable.
Mm,
And yet, yeah, kind of I started out saying that actually there are a number of groups across New Zealand who have got a very high level of control, very similar to Gloriavale, over individuals and families. So I talked a little bit about this kind of thing that, I'm not somebody who's out there trying to curb legitimate and beneficial expressions of religious freedom. But, my deep concern is when those expressions of spirituality or religious freedom are themselves curtailing other
mm,
human rights of their members or of their families or of those around them. And I was sort of saying, if my right to religious freedom, so called, means that I'm just simply allowed to, in the name of religious freedom, I'm allowed to restrict your education, if I'm allowed to restrict your freedom of movement around the country, or restrict your right to leave the religion or to have your own religious or non-religious beliefs, then actually something's wrong.
mm,
If my so-called right to religious freedom means that I can highly control your employment opportunities or your higher education or career opportunities, then something's wrong. And so I kind of said, if me expressing my right to religious freedom means that I can trample all over other legitimate and sacred human rights, then there's actually something wrong. And yeah, my kind of call was, you know what, people, this actually is happening right across our nation. There are many human rights of many people across our nation being restricted and curtailed and trampled on. And there's something wrong with a government that is allowing this or turning a blind eye to this, or
mm.
even rewarding these groups by giving them charitable status. Some of them,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's yeah. So did a bit of a rant.
You did, and it was a powerful rant, I have to say. So, I like what Janja said about how about putting your own kids in one of these groups for 6 months and see how much you can no longer care about the trampling of those human rights. So it's when it's someone else's kids, when it's someone else's life, it doesn't seem to matter so much, does it? Um,
That's right. Yeah. And yet, I'm like, man, this is impacting you, even right here in Parliament, more than you realise. Like, I'm like, there's, there's some groups across our country where their members are not allowed to even vote, or they're not being encouraged or taught how to vote, or they're not allowed to study and train and be a politician as a career choice. Like,
Mm,
their very ability to participate in civic life is being controlled and arguably coerced and restricted. And that's terrible. That's a
mm,
travesty. Like, the
mm, mm.
government should be caring about this, that people
Yeah.
can't participate in the very social systems of their own country.
And exactly, and to do nothing is quite expensive. I quoted, and I think someone else did, the costs to that were brought up in the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care that showed that children who were abused in a care environment, institutional or religious, cost the country $857,000 per person. It's like it actually doesn't make any economic sense to stand by and do nothing because you
I
pay the
could
price later on.
I could not agree more. That is such an important statement, Kaz. And yeah, I think that again, often Kiwis are kind of like, oh, just, let my neighbours do whatever they want in their own backyard. It's not my business type of thing. But yeah, quite aside from the kind of psychological impact and all that kind of thing, for those who kind of, yeah, are only going to be moved by economic impact, there is a massive economic impact, mostly due to health outcomes, and it's something we
And
can't afford to ignore.
And failure of income, failure of that person contributing to society for their whole life, like it, and being, instead of contributing, actually being a burden on society because they've been so harmed by
Exactly.
what's happened to them. It really doesn't make any sense. And everyone loses out in that situation.
Exactly.
Um, but I think we've only got 5 minutes left. So I think we need to just say something about what we asked from the government. What did we want them to do for us?
Yeah, well, I kind of gave a final call saying, we need you, our government, to know and understand the impact of high control groups across New Zealand, that this impact is significant, it's strategic at times, and it's lasting. And I said we need you to ensure that the religious rights of these groups does not give them a free pass to trample on other human rights of their own members or others who they interact with. I mean, there's a whole lot of things I said, but yeah, I finished by saying I'd really love three things: to show a commitment to taking this seriously by working to engage a nationwide government agency that can focus on three things. One, to research and monitor high demand groups and ideologies across our nation. Two, that it can resource and support former members or survivors of harm. And three, that it can provide the public as well as the kind of health, education, and legal professions with non-partisan, up-to-date information and education in this area.
Mm,
So,
mm,
nothing
nothing
too
big.
big. Just,
Yeah,
yep.
nothing too big. Yeah. Yeah.
You asked for something similar, didn't you?
Well, I kind of thought, well, if we talk about that too much, they'll go, that's too hard. So I thought I'd start with something a bit smaller, which is basically the step towards that. I kind of said, look, there's a huge lack of awareness. We've got all these victims popping up all over the place because no one knows anything about cults. So there's just this steady supply of innocent, naive recruits who don't understand coercive control and influence that they can end up being recruitees of. So, like there's no protection for them as well if they do get in a group. Plus, we have all the people coming out in droves. And I also drew attention to the fact that we've got 1,500 people arriving in New Zealand every year from international environments who are refugees here in New Zealand. And we have funding for those people who've come out of traumatic environments, who've lost everything, who don't know the world that they're entering into, who need appropriate supports to be successfully homed in this country. There's this Mangere Refugee Centre where they all arrive to, spend 6 weeks upskilling, and they get sort of spread over the country with supports put in place for them. Plus, they get access to unemployment benefit, two, or it might even be longer, years worth of free medical visits, all this sort of stuff, this package of care that goes around these people from other countries who aren't New Zealand citizens. It's like, that's going on already. We know how to do it for people who are strangers to our land. What about our our people. So we need to, I also talked about upskilling our workers, because we actually don't have many workers, and we need to have a focused approach on building a workforce and stopping the really small workforce we've got from burning out. So I actually said, what we need is a working group. So I'd be quite happy if we started off with a commissioned, funded group of people from multiple disciplines: education, health, law, social services, child welfare services, safeguarding, all across the kind of spectrums of kind of life in some ways, who could come together and actually pull something together and go, look, we need some more research. This is the areas we need to start training people in. This is the size of the problem. Because right now this has all been done by volunteers, right? And if it's a commissioned group who's been given authority by our government, they are much more likely to listen and pay attention, and if they're funding it, take action in response to their advice. So I think until this is something that's actually commissioned, it's just volunteers in the background bleating on. They actually need to make some kind of commitment to information gathering, because that could then impact on legislation changes as well. So that's what I said. So
that's amazing. Let's hope they listen.
Let's hope they listen. Anyway, it's been easy to reflect on our government talk, Linda. You thought that you might not remember it, but it's been absolutely easy. There was so much. It was very exciting. And we want to say thank you to our listeners for listening in. And we hope that you will keep listening to Cult Chat, that you will like us on our Facebook page, you'll listen to us on Apple Podcast or Spotify or Plains FM. Thanks again to Plains FM, of course, who support this work.
And feel free to send this episode to your local MPs as well and encourage them to listen along to Cult Chat. That's
a great idea. So I think that's all for us. It'll be a ka kite anō from me.
See you later.
Okay, bye-bye.
If anything in today's episode was difficult or upsetting for you and you would like to talk to somebody, we encourage our New Zealand listeners to free call or text 1737 for support from a trained counsellor. Or you might like to visit the resources section of the Olive Leaf Network website, where you can find a range of organisations and resources that might be able to support you. We would also like to remind you that the views and thoughts and opinions that have been expressed in this program are the speakers alone, and Cult Chat does not necessarily endorse or share them.